The EU bans almost all Russian oil. But can the bloc survive without Moscow's supplies? And how much will this latest set of sanctions actually hurt the Kremlin? I'm Andrea Sankey, and today's newsmaker is the EU's Russian oil ban. Russia is one of the world's largest crude oil exporters. In 2019, it accounted for more than $120 billion of export revenue. But since its attack on Ukraine, many of its buyers are looking elsewhere. This week, the European Union agreed to ban almost all seaborne Russian oil exports by December as part of its sixth set of Kremlin sanctions.
I'm very glad that the leaders were able to agree in principle on the six sanctions package. This is very important. Thanks to this, Council should now be able to finalize a ban on almost 90% of all Russian oil imports by the end of the year. This is an important step forward. Now left over is the around about 10 or 11% that are covered by the southern Družba. And indeed, here we have agreed, this is for the moment being exempted. We have agreed to, that the Council will revert to the topic as soon as possible in one way or the other. So this is a topic where we'll come back to and where we will still have to work on. But it is a big step forward, what we did today.
The punishment is expected to hurt Moscow, but it could also hurt the EU. The bloc has relied heavily on Russian oil. Just take a look at these numbers.
Last year, the European Union was importing 2.2 million barrels of Russian crude oil every single day. That's almost 25% of the bloc's total oil imports. Germany was collecting the most, bringing in 687,000 barrels per day. The Netherlands imported 414,000, and Finland bought 201,000 barrels on a daily basis. But while they were some of the biggest buyers, they weren't the bloc's most dependent. 83% of Lithuania's crude oil came from the Kremlin. For Finland, it was 80%. Almost 3/4 of Slovakia's oil imports came from Russia. For Poland, it was more than half, and Hungary bought about 43% of its crude oil and refined oil from Vladimir Putin's Russia.
So Western economies could take a massive hit with the introduction of this oil embargo. The EU will need to find supplies elsewhere, while Moscow will also need to find new buyers. But they're confident they can, after EU Commission President Ursula von der Leyen welcomed the bloc's ban on Twitter. Russian diplomat Mikhail Ulyanov hit back.
As she rightly said yesterday, Russia will find other importers. Noteworthy that now she contradicts her own yesterday's statements. Very quick change of the mindset indicates that the EU is not in a good shape.
So how effective will this sixth round of sanctions be? Here to debate that and more, I'm joined now from Baku by Matthew Bryza. He's a senior fellow at the Atlantic Council's Eurasia Center and a former U.S. ambassador to Azerbaijan. In Ankara, we have political analyst Klaus Jurgens, and from London is energy aspects analyst Leon Izbicki. Thanks so much for being with us, all three. You know, the EU was very proud to announce the consensus it finally reached. But let's talk about how much practical impact this is all going to have. Moscow has been selling it in this way. They're saying that these sanctions will lead to a global fuel supply shortage that will drive oil prices up, meaning Moscow effectively is able to sell less oil for the same money, while Europeans are going to face massive energy price hikes. So, Leon, who really stands to gain the most here?
Well, I mean, I think there's definitely a portion of truth in that statement from Russia. You are looking at a situation in which there might be an imperfect rebalancing of global energy supplies, and in particular oil markets, where some of those volumes of crude oil and of oil products might just be lost because they can't be adequately shipped to other markets, such as, for example, China or in India, where you are seeing possible off-takers of those Russian volumes. So if that is the case, you are looking at a situation in which there simply is going to be a net loss to global supply, in which markets are going to correspondingly increase prices as a result of that, and in which Russia will be able to sell less volume for a higher price overall.
Okay. You mentioned China and India. You know, we're looking at about a 90% cut in Russian oil exports to the EU. But tell us more about how Russia can maybe supplement its losses by selling to countries like China and India. Or is the infrastructure, that's another question, is the infrastructure potentially not even there to really offload enough of those supplies to compensate for the EU loss?
I think one of the constraints is definitely infrastructure. When you look at most pipeline infrastructure, also with respect to oil, but most importantly also with respect to gas, of course, pointing more towards the west as opposed to the east. Now, that's a trend that has been changing over the last couple of years, with multiple infrastructure projects being implemented to also enable higher flows to the east. But you are still looking at a situation in which Russia is dependent on quite a significant amount of oil tankers, essentially, transporting those oil products and crude oil into different markets. You're looking at a situation in which European sanctions would make it more difficult, would actually ban European insurers to insure those tankers that are transporting fuel from Russia into other markets, which just further complicates it for other countries such as China or India to actually organize those shipments into those countries. Now, that doesn't mean that that it's not going to hurt Russia. You're looking at Russian oil already struggling to find off-takers, with it trading at a significant discount to Brent crude. But you're also seeing the potential for Chinese and Indian insurers to actually step in and to try and finance and insure those tankers coming into those markets in order to increase the overall offtake of Russian volumes.
Okay. Klaus, let me turn to you. Do you think overall this is going to benefit what the EU is looking to achieve here? And also, when the EU talks about phasing out Russian oil and gas, who replaces it? Who's going to fill that void? Are they going to lean on countries that are also undesirable, according to the EU, like Saudi?
Well, hello. Thanks for being on the show. Now, it is indeed, when you look at the figures, and as the EU Commission President said yesterday, by 2023, they're planning to have a reduction of by 90%. Now, these are now peanuts. The EU must immediately come to terms with it, from where and by whom to replace it. And as you've mentioned, Saudi Arabia, it is not that easy. Now, there has a debate going on for the past couple of years during the corona crisis, interestingly enough. I think it is not only about sanctions and reducing the imports from Russia, and we all know this can take between 6 and 8 months, and this is a long, long time, whereas the aggression continues in Ukraine. Now, this is the first point I wanted to make. I'm very, very unhappy about a 6 or 8 months delay. At the same time, I think it's not only about reducing imports. Europe really has to come to terms with it, change energy diversification, change the way we use energy, reduce energy at home in companies everywhere. Now, Hungary, for example, 65% of oil come from Russia. It can't be replaced overnight. Hence, they got this kind of watered-down deal a day ago. The EU, 27% oil exports from Russia and 40% gas. Now, what I wanted to say is, yes, there will be an embargo. It will be very late, but this would not really change that situation. If another crisis, God forbid, erupts somewhere else, Europe must really change the way energy is sourced and energy is used.
Right, something they've been saying for a long time. It has been acknowledged, but it's changing consumer behavior is also extremely difficult. But Matthew, if I can turn to you, because I want to look at the kind of diplomatic or even psychological front in all this. You know, for decades, Russia survived under Stalin's self-reliance doctrine. Many Russians are familiar with it, and they're kind of willing to return to it, in a sense, to protect the homeland. Is the West underestimating how comfortable Russia actually is with what the West would consider total isolation?
Yeah, that is really the key question, Andrea, that few people are asking. And we, practitioners or former practitioners of U.S. foreign policy spend way too little time thinking about the psychological impact of what we plan to do. All you have to do is read a few Russian novels like Tolstoy, and you see that in Russian culture is embedded the idea that to suffer is to ennoble oneself. It's a noble thing to suffer. So that would argue that, well, okay, the Russians will put up with a turning back of their living standards, maybe to the pre-1990s era. On the other hand, what we don't know is how much of Homo Sovieticus still exists in Russia and how much the new generations in Russia who've come to age in the Putin era have come to expect and demand continually rising living standards. The fundamental social contract of Vladimir Putin has been, you stay out of politics and I'll keep increasing your living standards. So your question's not answerable right now. And I think there is going to be tension, but Russians can absorb a lot more suffering than we Americans or Europeans can. That's for sure.
Yeah, and it's going to be fundamental to how this all develops and what impact this sanctioning actually has. Leon, if I can come back to you, because I actually want to look at natural gas. The sixth round of sanctions focuses on Russian oil. The EU has talked about phasing out Russian gas supplies for some time. There's still no fixed date or agreement on that. But Germany, for example, doesn't even have, again, the infrastructure, to replace LNG, Russian LNG, with Qatari supplies, for example. So Germany actually said today that its gas supplies are secure, even after we have to mention Gazprom cut off supplies to Shell Energy. So, going forward so much to this, not least, what will winter 2022-23 look like in Europe?
So, you're looking at a situation in which gas prices are going to stay high also over the course of winter, as the European market looks to essentially minimize power sector gas demand and replace that with coal. And simultaneously to also trigger demand destruction among European industrials so that you actually see less consumption taking place, which is just going to free up more gas over winter to be available to satisfy, for example, residential and commercial or power sector gas demand that still remains. Now, the big question, of course, is what exactly is Europe's plan with respect to Russian volumes and Russian gas going forward? Because as you said, for example, Germany doesn't even have, at the moment at least, LNG infrastructure in place. It is purely dependent on pipeline deliveries, mostly from Russia. So you're already looking at a situation in which those infrastructure projects are being advanced at breakneck speeds, where Germany, for example, has already chartered 4 FSRUs, so mobile reliquefaction capacities or ships to be docked in Germany to provide that LNG capacity. But those are projects that are going to take until around 2023 to actually be implemented and fully working. Until then, Europe is still dependent on that Russian molecule in order to actually make it through winter.
I would say, when Germany, just let me confirm with you, when you hear from Germany that their gas supplies are secure and that consumers should not worry, we can believe that?
So I think it depends on the time frame, as a lot of things do. I think we're looking at a situation in which we already have very strong injections in European gas markets, which means that in the event of a complete loss of Russian volumes, we would probably make it through summer and potentially through 1 or 2 months in winter. But during those winter months, when we are seeing that peak in demand for natural gas, particularly from the heating sector, we are looking at a situation in which the only real way for the European market to actually still balance is to have significant government interventions which trigger rationing programs across the European continent in order to allocate gas volumes to protected consumers, such as end consumers, households, and the power sector.
Right, okay. Jurgen, if I can look at the kind of wider European dynamics with you, there are those, of course, who are not standing in solidarity with the EU, not least Hungary, which is an EU member, but there's also Serbia, who pretty proudly announced it had cut a very beneficial deal with Moscow on energy supplies. So how much does that potentially soften the blow of EU sanctions?
I think it does to a great extent. Whilst preparing, I put a number of cards in front of me, literally and figuratively speaking. We have a Cyprus card, we have a Serbia card, we have a Hungary card, and let us not forget we have a Putin post-Brexit, post-Corona card. Now, very, very briefly, each of them. The former East-West political cooperation, let's mention Gerhard Schröder one more time, we have to mention him, and his generation, the current German Chancellor, Olaf Scholz. There was this idea, we want to create peace and stop the arms race. Now, whatever happened, this heinous, this brutal, these atrocities which should have never ever happened on behalf of Russia, yes, but this should not erase an entire generation of efforts, because ultimately the people in Russia one day will suffer too. Some people would cynically say, let's hope for a post-Putin era. And at some stage, I truly believe in it, it will come. There will be a younger generation. There will be experienced people. They will simply say, we can't go on like this. This invasion was wrong. We must set a new record, a new tone. Hungary, yes, of course, totally dependent. Hungary, rather EU skeptical recently anyhow, debates with the European courts about laws. Then we have the Cyprus card. It was only announced some hours ago, and I believe yesterday it came out in the open. They would support sanctions, but they would not bar Russian nationals from buying real estate. Now here we go, Hungary out in the sanctions with oil, Cyprus with regards to rich individuals buying houses. Then we come to Serbia. I was not surprised at all that Serbia will try to strike a deal with Moscow regardless of the country's relations with the EU. So we have breakaways.
Okay. Right.
And I, last point if I may, the tough winter my esteemed colleague just mentioned. Public opinion in Germany is 100% going to shift away from an unconditional support for Ukraine when prices for energy and electricity and gas and everything besides inflation go up. Then questions will be asked to the government, can we not find an alternative? And this alternative in 8 months, playing devil's advocate, would there be a new deal struck with Russia?
Yeah, we'll have you back on the program in about 8 months' time when we see where supplies actually do stand and how secure they are and how consumers across Europe actually are feeling about the relationship with Russia and its energy supplies. But, you know, Matthew, if we look at these outliers, maybe if we call them, we think about who Russia still has as friends in the neighborhood. You know, Russia really stood by Serbia when Serbia resisted Kosovo and Montenegro's independence. So how much does Russia appreciate that solidarity with Serbia and Montenegro now? And what does all of that kind of, those allies say to the EU?
Yeah, I mean, for Russia, you know, protecting the Orthodox Christians has been a foreign policy demand or claim, you know, since the 19th century, since the Crimean War and before. So there's a deep nostalgia for fellow Orthodox Christians in Serbia or Montenegro, just like, you know, in Ukraine. And Serbia has had, especially under the Vučić government, very close relations with Moscow. And as you said, during those horrible Balkan wars and afterward, I mean, Russia was always on Serbia's side, and Russia expects in return some sort of loyalty as well from Serbia. But, you know, governments change. And there have been more pro and less pro-Russian governments in Belgrade and certainly in Podgorica in Montenegro. I mean, a couple of years ago, there were highly believable accusations that Russia tried to engineer a coup attempt, and that failed. So, you know, Russia, yeah, has Serbia as a friend, but you know, Serbia as a buddy, and then Hungary that's really just being incredibly selfish and reaping the benefits of buying Russian oil at huge discounts. So its refineries can generate enormous profits. Those really aren't friends that are necessarily going to stand by you when the going gets tough.
But it kind of goes back to my initial question with you, is how much, you know, Russia doesn't mind the isolation. And just as an added bonus, they actually do have enough friends that they feel can support each other and they can continue to function as they are accustomed to. Let me go back, though, to the energy question. Leon, I'll come back to you. You know, as I said before, Gazprom has suspended supplies to Shell and to a Denmark operation because those organizations have refused to pay in rubles, as Russia demands to kind of avoid currency collapse. Tell us who really gets hurt there. Is it working in Russia's favor?
Well, I think it's again a question of what is a trade-off between the lost volumes versus the higher prices that are a result of less supply coming into the European market. So overall, because we are seeing those high prices, there is definitely the potential for Russia to actually still increase its revenues from gas sales to Europe on a year-on-year basis, despite the significant drop in volumes that Russia actually sells into the European market.
Mm-hmm. Okay. You know what? I'll tell you what. We have a few minutes left, and there's, you know, these sanctions weren't just about Russian oil. Ursula von der Leyen spoke very proudly of de-swifting, as she put it, Sberbank, which is Russia's biggest bank. Klaus Jurgens, how much do you think that aspect of sanctioning affects the Russian economy? Is that actually the more powerful tool here?
I think in the long run, shutting someone off the international finance system is far more threatening instead of what we see now. I think the embargoes, the energy sanctions, Vladimir Putin and Russia will somehow, at least initially temporarily, manage to survive. But a complete shutdown with regards to international trade, the SWIFT system, how can people invest outside of Russia? I think this is something many of Vladimir Putin's very own inner circle will not want to see. And this is what I hinted at before. I really expect there will be a time, I'm not calling it a palace or Kremlin revolt, but there will be a group of people who might just say, look, this is all going one step too far. We have children, we have our country, we want to live freely, we don't want to be seen as the global aggressor for the next 100 years. So I think, yes, finance and markets, the SWIFT and the banking and foreign investment, and of course, FDI coming into Russia or not anymore, I think this is really what is going to hurt. And this could hopefully lead to a reversal of course.
Right. Matthew, what are your thoughts on that? Because as much as Russia knows what it feels like to be isolated because of so many decades under, you know, Soviet control, they also have now decades of experience with being part of a global community. Which do you think will actually outweigh in the position that Russians themselves take on this conflict and their relationship with the world?
Well, that was my point in the original question, that, you know, Russia's, yes, they are used to suffering, but there's a whole new generation that's come of age now, and they're used to Western living standards, and they expect that the social contract is they will be not politically active as long as Putin delivers their standard of living. They're losing their vacations to Europe and to Turkey. They're losing the international brands. They're not happy. Ultimately, everything comes down to politics, right? I mean, economic sanctions are tools used to drive political decisions, and in this case, a decision hopefully for Putin to end his war and to withdraw his troops from Ukraine. What's going to, I think, really drive whether or not Putin stays in power longer is whether or not he can convince the Russian people that Russia has won and not lost this war. He can convince them in the short run, I think, that, you know, do they achieve something? Russia achieves something, whether it's consolidating forces, controlling Luhansk or taking more territory, and then end the war. He can decide to do that because he controls the media. But if he leaves the Russian people thinking Russia lost this war, then his power is really threatened. And the history of Russia is that leaders, czars, lose power very often when Russia loses a war.
Leon, I'll tell you what, we just have a minute left. Let me just get your final thoughts here.
Yeah, I mean, I think ultimately the big question, you know, who is actually going to lose from the current sanctions packages? And I think to a large degree, this is also, you know, as my colleague said, a political question. You are looking at those sanctions also significantly hurting and impacting European end consumers. You're looking at coal import bans, tightening the coal market, in turn driving up gas prices. You're looking at potential retaliatory sanctions from Russia on further European companies, which is just going to tighten that gas market further, which obviously is also going to have implications for electricity markets, let alone the impact that we are seeing for oil sanctions. So the big question just becomes, especially over the winter months, as more and more of these price increases from the wholesale markets are actually going and feeding into the retail markets, can Europe continue to maintain the political consensus to actually keep up that momentum and that political pressure on Russia, because there is going to be that impact for the end consumer with potential ramifications for economic growth in Europe.
Right. Leon, I'm going to have to give you the final word. Very unfortunately, we're out of time for this edition of the Newsmakers. I'd like to thank Matthew Bryza and Klaus Jurgens so much also for joining us, and our viewers as well. Remember to subscribe to our YouTube channel. I'm Andrea Sankey, and we'll see you next time.